I knew something was wrong the moment I heard his phone vibrate on the kitchen counter, and he flinched like it had bitten him. Not because a phone buzzing is unusual, but because he lunged for it with this sharp, panicked movement I'd never seen in our 10 years together, knocking over his coffee and not even noticing the spill as he turned the screen face down and said too quickly, "It's nothing," before I'd even asked. That was the first crack, small but unmistakable, and it landed in my chest harder than it should have. We were standing in our socks on the cold tile, late for work like always, talking about whether the car needed gas. And suddenly the air felt different, heavy, like the room had shifted an inch to the left. I watched him wipe his hands on his jeans, ramble about a meeting he was already late for, and avoid my eyes with a focus that felt practiced. This wasn't the first strange moment, not really, but it was the first one that refused to slide past me. I was 34 then, and we'd been together for 10 years, married for 8. Long enough that doubt felt like a personal failure instead of a warning. For weeks, maybe months if I'm honest, there had been little things I kept explaining away because that's what you do when you've built a life with someone. The phone that never left his pocket, the way he angled the screen away from me on the couch, the sudden password change he shrugged off as work security, the nights he came home smelling like soap instead of his usual sweat and coffee, the way he started showering the second he walked in. None of it was enough on its own. And I didn't want to be the woman who policed her husband's phone or counted minutes or interrogated normal changes. So I told myself I was tired, stressed, imagining patterns where there were none. But that morning, watching him rush out the door without kissing me goodbye, leaving his coffee untouched and the door swinging shut behind him, I felt this quiet, steady certainty settle in, not loud or dramatic, just firm, like something clicking into place. I stood there alone in the kitchen, staring at the coffee spreading across the counter, and realized I didn't feel confused anymore. I felt alert, like my body had picked up on something my mind had been avoiding. I went to work and tried to focus, answered emails, sat through meetings, laughed at the right moments, but my attention kept drifting back to the way his hand had trembled when the phone buzzed, to the speed of his denial, to how fast nothing had left his mouth. By the time I drove home that evening, the sun already low and the radio playing softly, I wasn't wondering if something was wrong anymore. I was wondering how wrong it was, and how long I'd been standing this close to it without letting myself see it. I didn't plan to look through his phone that night, and I know how that sounds, but it happened because he left it on the bathroom sink when he jumped in the shower, steam already filling the room, and it buzzed once, then again, the screen lighting up with a name I didn't recognize, followed by a preview that said, "I can't stop thinking about last night," and my body reacted before my thoughts did. My hand already reaching for it as if I were grabbing something falling off a table. The phone unlocked with the same 4-digit code he'd used for years, which somehow made it worse, and the messages were right there, not buried, not hidden, just an open thread of weeks' worth of conversations that left no room for interpretation. Complaints about me framed as jokes, inside references I didn't recognize, photos I wish I could unsee, and lines like, "I miss your bed," and "He almost caught us," sitting there in plain black text on a white screen. I scrolled because I needed to know if there was any way this wasn't what it looked like, and each swipe made that hope more embarrassing, more impossible, especially when I hid a picture of a hotel receipt with today's date and a message right after that said, "Worth every lie." I remember sitting on the edge of the tub, the cold porcelain against my legs, the shower running behind me like static, and thinking very calmly, so this is it, this is the moment people talk about. I checked the contact details and saw it wasn't just a first name but a full one, a coworker I'd heard about in passing, someone he'd mentioned casually at dinner like she was just another name in his day, and there was a sick kind of clarity in that, a puzzle snapping together without resistance. When he turned the water off and reached for his towel, I was still holding the phone, my thumb hovering over messages that were intimate and logistical at the same time, plans and excuses woven together so efficiently it felt rehearsed. I didn't confront him then, not yet, because something in me needed to sit with the truth before I let him try to reshape it, and I walked out of the bathroom, phone still in my hand, and stood in the hallway breathing slowly, feeling like the floor was solid and unreal at the same time. If you've ever had a moment like this, you know how isolating it feels, and if you're listening to this and it resonates or brings up something you've lived through, you can quietly like or subscribe or leave a comment later. Not because this is entertainment, but because sometimes knowing you're not the only one helps more than you expect. When I finally unlocked the bedroom door, it wasn't because I felt ready, it was because the silence had stretched too long and started to feel like another kind of surrender, and I needed to hear what he was going to say even if I already hated the idea of it. He was sitting on the edge of the couch in the living room, fully dressed now, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like a man rehearsing a speech, and when he looked up at me his face settled into that careful, neutral expression he used in work meetings, the one that said he thought he could manage this if he stayed calm enough. I didn't raise my voice when I spoke, which surprised me, and all I asked was, how long? Not who or why or what I'd done wrong, just how long, because time felt like the most honest measure of betrayal. He exhaled slowly and said, "It's not what you think," which landed exactly as badly as you'd expect, and when I didn't respond he followed it with, "You're taking things out of context," even though we both knew there was no context where hotel receipts and explicit messages meant anything else. I asked again, slower this time, and he shook his head and said he didn't want to fight, that he'd been under a lot of pressure, that work had been intense, that we'd been distant lately, words sliding past the actual question like oil on water. When I mentioned her name, watching his reaction carefully, he stiffened for just a second before masking it, and that tiny delay told me more than his explanation ever could. He insisted they were just friends, that the messages were jokes that had gone too far, that nothing physical had happened the way I was imagining, and when I said I'd seen the receipt and the pictures, he frowned like I'd accused him of something unfair and said I was invading his privacy, flipping the script so smoothly it made my stomach turn. The conversation felt circular and exhausting, like pushing against a door that kept swinging back into place, and every time I pressed for a clear answer he countered with a question about my tone or my assumptions or whether I trusted him at all. I could feel myself slipping into that familiar dynamic where I explained my feelings carefully and he corrected my interpretation of events, and I hated how quickly my certainty started to feel negotiable in the face of his calm, measured denials. When I said flatly, "Are you sleeping with her?" he didn't answer right away, just rubbed his face and looked away, and that pause stretched long enough to fill the room with everything he wasn't saying. That pause stayed with me longer than anything he'd said because it wasn't confusion or shock, it was hesitation, and once I saw it I couldn't unsee it, so I repeated the question and moved closer, standing in front of him so he had to look at me. And that's when his patience started to crack in small, irritated ways, his jaw tightening, his voice sharpening as he told me I was interrogating him, that I was acting irrational, that this was exactly why he hadn't wanted to talk yet. I told him I wasn't interested in his tone policing or his excuses and asked again, and this time he stood up, suddenly too big for the room, pacing a few steps before turning back to me with his hands raised like I was the unreasonable one, saying I was blowing a few messages out of proportion and that if I'd just listened instead of spiraling, we could have had a normal conversation. I reminded him of the photo, the receipt, the words I'd read with my own eyes, and he snapped that I shouldn't have gone through his phone in the first place, that trust goes both ways, and for a split second I almost laughed at how neatly he tried to balance that scale. The more I stayed calm, the more agitated he became, his sentences getting shorter, his explanations thinner, and I could see him cycling through options in real time, deciding what version of the truth might still work. When I asked if she'd been in our house, his eyes flashed with anger and he said that was none of my business, then immediately corrected himself and said no, obviously not, too quickly again, the same way he'd said, "It's nothing," that morning. I told him I wasn't leaving the conversation until he answered me honestly, and he scoffed, saying honesty is subjective, that relationships are complicated, that I wasn't perfect either, vague accusations with no details attached, thrown out just to muddy the water. The power struggle was obvious now, not loud but sharp, him trying to regain control by reframing the situation as mutual misunderstanding instead of unilateral betrayal, and me refusing to move from the facts no matter how uncomfortable it made him. I said her name again and asked him to look me in the eye and tell me nothing had happened, and this time he couldn't do it, his gaze dropping to the floor, his shoulders sagging just a fraction, and that small collapse told me I was closer to the truth than he wanted me to be. He muttered that I was pushing too hard, that I was turning something manageable into a disaster, and when I replied quietly that I didn't create this by asking questions, I watched his irritation give way to something else, something heavier and more resigned, like a man realizing the exits were closing one by one. He stopped pacing and leaned against the kitchen counter like his legs had finally given up on him, and for a few seconds neither of us spoke, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic outside, ordinary noises that felt strangely intrusive given what was about to land between us. And when he finally talked, his voice was lower, stripped of the defensive edge he'd been using all evening, which scared me more than the anger had. He said my name the way he used to when something serious was coming, then rubbed the back of his neck and stared at the wall instead of at me, and told me he didn't want to hurt me, which I immediately understood meant he was about to say something that already had. I asked him to stop prefacing and just answer the question, and that's when he admitted in pieces at first that yes, something had happened, but it wasn't planned, it wasn't supposed to turn into this, it was just one mistake that got complicated, phrases tumbling out like they might soften the impact if he stacked enough of them together. I asked him how long again, and he said a few months, then corrected himself to say maybe longer depending on what I meant by this. And that distinction alone felt like another betrayal, the way he tried to redefine reality even as he confessed it. When I pressed him about the hotel, about the messages, about whether he'd lied to my face while coming home and sitting across from me at dinner, he nodded once barely and said yes quietly enough that I almost missed it, and something inside me went very still, like my body had decided to shut down anything unnecessary to survive the moment. He tried to explain how it started, how they worked late together, how she understood his stress, how it felt harmless until it wasn't, and I remember thinking how familiar the script sounded, how many times I'd heard versions of this story from other people and never imagined I'd be standing in my own kitchen listening to it unfold in real time. When I asked him if he loved her, he flinched and said no too fast, then said he didn't know, then said it wasn't about love at all. It was about escape, about feeling seen, about not thinking, explanations that felt self-centered and hollow given the damage sitting between us. The most shocking part wasn't even the admission itself. It was the way he seemed relieved once the words were out, like carrying the secret had been heavier for him than the consequences were going to be, and that realization cut deeper than anything else he said. I asked if it was still going on, and he hesitated just long enough to answer the question without actually answering it, saying they hadn't talked much since I found out, which told me everything I needed to know. When I said I couldn't believe he'd looked me in the eye and denied it hours earlier, he shrugged, exhausted now, and said he panicked, that he didn't know how to tell me, that he hoped he could fix it before I ever knew. And I remember feeling this sharp, bitter clarity that the confession wasn't an act of honesty, it was a surrender forced by evidence he couldn't erase. I sat down at the table because my knees suddenly felt unreliable, and he stayed standing, hovering like he didn't know where to put himself, and in that physical distance between us I felt the full weight of what had shifted, not just that he'd slept with someone else, but that the version of our marriage I'd been living in no longer existed. There was no dramatic yelling or throwing things, just this heavy, suffocating awareness that the truth had finally surfaced, and it was uglier and more mundane than I'd imagined. Not a single explosive moment, but a slow, irreversible collapse. And as he kept talking, trying to explain himself into something more palatable, I realized I wasn't listening anymore, because the shock wasn't in the details. It was in the certainty that nothing he said next was going to put this back the way it was. That night didn't end with a decision or a resolution, it just thinned out into exhaustion, the kind that leaves you sitting at opposite ends of the same couch staring at nothing. And at some point he asked if we should sleep, and I told him to take the guest room without raising my voice, surprised by how steady I sounded when everything else felt unstable. I lay awake for hours listening to unfamiliar sounds in a house I'd lived in for years, the floorboards shifting when he walked down the hall, the soft click of a door closing, every noise a reminder that something fundamental had been rearranged without my consent. The next morning we moved around each other carefully, like co-workers after a bad meeting. And when he tried to make coffee the way he always had, reaching automatically for my mug, I stopped him with a look I didn't know I could give, one that made him pause and set it down without a word. We didn't talk about rules or next steps or forgiveness, not yet, but the consequences showed up anyway in small, unavoidable ways. He ate breakfast standing up, I took calls in the bedroom instead of the kitchen, we texted instead of speaking when logistics were unavoidable. I went to work and tried to act normal, but the world felt off by a fraction, like the volume had been turned down, and when a coworker asked how my weekend had been, I said fine out of habit and felt strangely disconnected from the word as it left my mouth. Friends noticed something was wrong before I told them anything, the way I canceled plans, the way I stared too long at my phone without responding, and when I finally told one close friend over a rushed lunch, keeping my voice low and my details sparse, She reacted with anger on my behalf that I couldn't yet access, and her certainty made me feel both supported and oddly hollow. At home, the tension settled into the walls, not explosive but constant, and arguments flared over insignificant things like trash and laundry, each one a proxy for the larger damage neither of us knew how to navigate. He alternated between apologetic and defensive, sometimes saying he'd do anything to fix it, sometimes acting irritated that I wasn't moving faster toward forgiveness, and I started to see how uncomfortable he was sitting with consequences that couldn't be negotiated away. There were stretches of silence that felt heavier than shouting, evenings where we sat in separate rooms pretending to watch television, the distance between us measured in feet but feeling much larger, and I noticed how often he checked his phone before remembering he wasn't supposed to. I slept poorly, waking up with a tight jaw and a racing mind, replaying conversations, noticing details I'd missed before, and during the day I functioned on autopilot, answering emails, attending meetings, doing the things required of me while a quieter part of my attention tracked how quickly trust had evaporated once it was punctured. He suggested counseling after a few days, presenting it like a reasonable next step, and I told him I wasn't ready to discuss solutions when I was still absorbing the damage, and the look on his face told me he'd hoped structure might contain what he'd broken. Family calls became minefields, my mother sensing something off and asking careful questions I deflected, his parents inviting us to dinner and me inventing excuses because I couldn't sit across from them without feeling like I was lying by omission. The affair had ended our normal routines without asking permission, and as the days passed, the weight of it showed up everywhere, not just in emotional moments but in the quiet, practical spaces where our life used to operate smoothly, leaving me with the growing realization that even if the shock faded, the shape of our days had already changed. As the weeks stretched on, the initial shock gave way to a dull, persistent strain that settled into every interaction, and I started to notice how much energy it took just to exist in the same space without reacting, without asking questions I already knew would lead nowhere useful. He tried to be considerate in clumsy ways, texting before coming home to ask if I needed space, offering to cook dinner and then abandoning the idea when I didn't respond, hovering like someone waiting for instructions that no longer applied. One evening he asked if we could check in, using the careful language of someone who'd read an article about repairing trust, and I told him I didn't have anything new to say, which was true, because all my thoughts felt unfinished, looping without landing. At work, my concentration slipped in subtle but dangerous ways, missing details, rereading the same email 3 times, and when my manager asked if everything was okay, I nodded automatically, realizing how trained I was to protect other people from discomfort even while my own life felt unstable. The affair started to bleed into practical decisions we couldn't avoid, like finances and schedules, conversations that used to be neutral now carrying an undercurrent of resentment and caution, and I became acutely aware of how many assumptions our marriage had relied on, how many things only worked because I believed we were operating in good faith. He told me he'd cut off contact with her and showed me a brief message ending things, written in a tone that felt strangely gentle given the destruction attached to it, and while part of me registered the gesture, another part noted how quickly he wanted acknowledgement for doing the bare minimum. I found myself pulling away physically without making a conscious choice, stepping back when he moved closer, sleeping with my back turned, my body reacting faster than my mind could negotiate. Friends started asking more directly if something was wrong, and I told a second person, then a third, each time feeling both relief and embarrassment, as if naming it made it more real but also less private, and I learned quickly which reactions helped and which ones didn't. Some people wanted me to be decisive, to leave or forgive immediately, and their certainty felt intrusive, while others just listened, letting the silence sit without trying to fix it, and those conversations stayed with me longer. At home, the air felt permanently tense, not hostile but strained, like a muscle held too tight for too long, and even neutral moments carried weight, a shared laugh cutting off too early, a familiar gesture feeling out of place. He apologized often but inconsistently, sometimes sincerely, sometimes with an edge of frustration that suggested he wanted progress he hadn't earned, and I started to see how differently we experienced time, him eager to move forward, me still orienting myself to what had already happened. I began taking longer walks after work, not to clear my head exactly but to delay going back into the house, using the movement to think through things I hadn't let myself articulate yet, like what staying would actually require and whether I recognized myself in that version of the future. The damage wasn't loud anymore, but it was constant, showing up in pauses, in decisions deferred, in the way I no longer assumed his version of events was complete. And by the end of that week, I understood that the consequences weren't confined to the affair itself. They were embedded in how I now moved through my own life, more cautious, more aware, and increasingly unsure that returning to what we had was either possible or something I truly wanted. The decision didn't arrive as a dramatic realization or a single defining moment. It crept in quietly through a series of small recognitions that accumulated until they felt undeniable, like noticing the tide has gone out without remembering when it started. One morning, while drinking coffee alone at the kitchen table, I caught myself feeling relieved that he was still asleep in the guest room, and that relief landed heavier than any argument we'd had, because it wasn't anger or spite, it was clarity. I realized how much effort I was spending managing his reactions, gauging his moods, deciding which version of myself to present so the day wouldn't derail, and how little of that energy was being returned to me. When he talked about rebuilding, about timelines and counseling and commitment, I heard sincerity mixed with urgency, a desire to stabilize his life rather than an understanding of what he'd destabilized in mine. I started to picture what staying would look like in concrete terms. Not abstract hope but daily reality, the constant vigilance, the quiet calculations, the work of trusting someone who had proven how easily he could compartmentalize, and that future felt exhausting in a way I couldn't rationalize away. I met with a therapist alone, framing it as a way to get perspective, and during that first session I found myself speaking more freely than I had at home, admitting things I hadn't said out loud yet, like how the affair had altered the way I saw him, not as a partner who made a terrible choice, but as someone capable of a sustained deception I hadn't anticipated. There was no judgment in that room, just space, and in that space I noticed how my body relaxed when I talked about leaving compared to how tight my chest felt when I talked about staying. At home, he sensed the shift before I named it, asking more frequently where my head was at, his questions edged with anxiety, and I responded honestly without being cruel, telling him I needed time and that reassurance couldn't be rushed. One evening, after another strained dinner eaten mostly in silence, he asked directly if I was thinking about ending the marriage, and instead of deflecting or softening, I said yes, not because I was certain of the outcome, but because pretending otherwise felt dishonest. The word hung between us, heavy but oddly grounding, and he reacted with a mix of sadness and frustration, pointing out the years we'd invested, the plans we'd made, the life we'd built, and I listened, recognizing the validity of those facts without feeling bound by them. What surprised me most was how little guilt I felt about prioritizing my own well-being, not because I didn't care, but because I'd reached a point where continuing to sacrifice my sense of safety for the sake of continuity felt unsustainable. I started looking at logistics, quietly and methodically, reviewing finances, considering living arrangements, not as an act of revenge or punishment, but as preparation. And that practical focus brought a steadiness I hadn't felt since before the discovery. When I finally told him I wanted to separate, I did it calmly, sitting across from him at the same table where so many ordinary conversations had taken place, explaining that I couldn't rebuild trust on a foundation that now felt unstable, that my decision wasn't about punishment but about recognizing my limits. He listened, really listened this time, and while there was pain in his response, there was also resignation, as if part of him understood that the outcome wasn't arbitrary. That night, after he went to the guest room, I sat alone in the living room and felt something close to peace for the first time in weeks, not because everything was resolved, but because I had finally aligned my actions with what I knew to be true for me. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected, not peaceful exactly, but steady, marked by practical conversations about moving dates and shared accounts, by boxes slowly filling with the ordinary evidence of a life being divided, and by a surprising absence of the chaos I'd braced myself for. He moved out on a Sunday morning while I was at a friend's place, a decision we made together to avoid turning it into a scene, and when I came home that afternoon the house felt different in a neutral way, not hollow or dramatic, just altered, like furniture had been rearranged and my body needed time to relearn the space. I cried later, alone, not because I doubted the decision, but because endings still hurt even when they're necessary, and I let that be true without trying to interpret it as a sign. Over time, My days began to settle into a rhythm that belonged to me again. Mornings without tension, evenings where I didn't feel the need to monitor anyone else's mood. Small freedoms I hadn't realized I'd been missing until they returned. People asked careful questions and I answered them selectively, learning that I didn't owe anyone a narrative that made them comfortable, only the truth I could live with. The betrayal didn't disappear from my history, but it stopped being the center of my attention, becoming something I carried rather than something that carried me, and that shift mattered more than any apology ever could. I didn't come away from it feeling superior or hardened, just clearer about my boundaries and less willing to negotiate them away for the sake of familiarity. If you're listening to this and you've been sitting with a truth you keep postponing because it feels disruptive, I hope you hear that clarity doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it's quiet and persistent and asks you to trust it anyway. And if parts of this story resonated with you, or if you've lived through something similar and want to share your experience, you're welcome to leave a comment, not as a judgment or advice exchange, but as a reminder that these moments don't happen in isolation. You can also like or subscribe if you want to hear more stories told honestly and without dramatics, the kind that don't promise easy answers but do offer recognition. I'm not telling this from a place of triumph, just from a place of alignment, where my actions finally matched what I knew to be true, and that has been enough. Thank you for listening all the way through, for holding space for a story like this, and for being part of a conversation that values quiet resolve over spectacle.